Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us here today. I'm Susanna Blume. On the end, we have Elbridge Colby and Chris Dougherty here in the middle. We are the CNAS defense team. And now we would like to invite you to play a game with us. For the next hour, you, dear audience, are going to be the president, the commander-in-chief in this scenario, and we three are your aides. This is an interactive exercise in which you will get to vote on U.S. courses of action using your smartphones. So if you could get those out and queue up the CNAS conference app now, that would be great. If you go to the schedule and select this session, a deadly game, at the bottom you'll find a live poll option. You can open that up, but please do not vote yet. We will tell you when it's time. We're going to start by presenting the military situation as it stands today in the year 2025. We're going to walk you through the pros and cons of two different courses of action that you can take. And then we're going to ask you to vote on what you think the best option is using that app. Then we're going to tell you what happened as a result of that decision. We'll give you two more options to choose from for what to do next. And we're going to repeat this process for a total of 3 moves. And additionally, we're going to hold time at the end to answer any questions that you might have. As you've been doing all day, you can submit questions using the note cards. You can submit them through the app or through Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2019.
During this exercise, we hope to show you why the current American way of war doesn't work against China, and why it needs to evolve to meet the challenges of great power competition in the 21st century. The 2018 National Defense Strategy focuses the Department of Defense on deterring or defeating Chinese aggression. Unfortunately, China has studied the current American way of war and has figured out how to beat it. This is why the core problem of the strategy is arresting and reversing the erosion of the American military's conventional advantage. This exercise uses a fictional but plausible scenario to show just some of the ways that China could disrupt the American way of war, limit the options available to US policymakers, and harm America's vital national interests. I explain this in greater detail in my new report, Why America Needs a New Way of War, which is available in hard copy in the lobby and online at cnas.org. Now, this exercise is based on the current American way of war. And what that means is that the options presented to you today will all be flawed to some degree. As you will see, the United States needs new and better options to confront China. And that will require a new American way of war and new concepts and capabilities to enable it.
Well, great. So you've gotten the backstory. Now let's set the scene. Place yourself in the year 2024. In this year, Taiwan elects a president from a party on the island supporting much closer relations with the mainland. The following year, under intense pressure from Beijing to resolve the quote-unquote Taiwan problem in the lifetime of Xi Jinping, the new president of Taiwan signs a joint communique effectively conceding to Beijing's demands for the future resolution of the cross-strait issues. This action sparks massive protests on Taiwan, where very few people want any form of political integration with the mainland after watching China's oppression of Hong Kong in the years after 2019. As the protests and political crisis on the island drag on, Taiwan's new president reluctantly bends to popular pressure and agrees to hold a referendum on cross-strait relations in order to appease their demands. In Beijing, the leadership fears that circumstances are now spinning out of its control and decides that it's time to intervene. This decision is driven in part by China's perception that the military balance in the region and locally has tipped in its favor. Now, why does this matter? The United States has a long-standing commitment to Taiwan, including most prominently through the Taiwan Relations Act. And I think you heard a very superb elucidation of that in the discussion this morning by the senators. While many Americans don't pay much attention to the specific conditions on Taiwan, many governments in the region do. And they see Taiwan's security and the way America acts toward it as a bellwether. Bottom line, if the United States fails to effectively defend Taiwan in the face of Chinese pressure or even aggression, what does that say about them? Defending Taiwan is even more important because Taiwan is a vigorous, flourishing democracy, while China has hardened into an even more repressive dictatorship in the last decade.
Now, Mr. President, here is the current military situation as it stands. Our intelligence suggests that China is preparing for imminent operations to compel Taiwan to join the mainland. This activity includes increased readiness at Chinese bases in the region, major concentrations of military and commercial transports at ports opposite Taiwan, and last, Chinese submarines are leaving ports and heading out to sea. Now, we're not clear on what China's intentions are. They could be preparing for an invasion, or they may be planning a blockade. Last, they may simply be posturing to get Taiwan to back away from the referendum and return to the status quo. One thing is certain, China will seek to use time and geography to its advantage during this crisis. We may have a more powerful military, but our forces are spread around the globe, so it takes time to get them into the fight. Meanwhile, China is just about 90 miles from Taiwan, so it can mass its forces much more quickly than we can. Our military has an unmatched ability to move forces globally, but this is difficult even for us, to move this amount of force this far, this fast. In addition, China will be working to prevent us from deploying through the use of anti-access and area denial systems. In plain English, sir, these are weapons designed to slow us down, trip us up, and make it difficult for us to operate the way that we would wish to. If China believes that we are about to intervene on behalf of Taiwan, they'll attack us in space and cyberspace to take out our eyes, ears, and nervous system. They will attack our forward bases to destroy our aircraft on the ground where they are most vulnerable. They will also use air, missile, and submarine attacks to hold our surface vessels at long range from the Chinese mainland and limit their ability to intervene. They will also attack our logistics networks, making it difficult for us to keep our forces in the theater resupplied. Finally, Mr. President, we have to talk about escalation. China is not a terrorist group or some small regional bully like Iran. They have means to strike us in the homeland, particularly including advanced cyber weapons. And while they have a policy stating that they won't be the first party in a conflict to use nuclear weapons, we cannot assume that they will not use them or threaten their use. Now that I've given you the bad news, Mr. President, I have to point out that the Chinese aren't 10 feet tall, and they face significant hurdles in invading Taiwan, provided that we play our cards right. Now, amphibious invasions are incredibly difficult, and this will be a tough one for China. Across 90 miles of open ocean onto an island with difficult terrain and lots of dense urban areas. Even if they succeed in getting ashore, they will have difficulty keeping their forces resupplied and reinforced. That is, if we can keep the pressure on them.
So, Mr. President, we have two options prepared for you to consider. Option A seeks to deter China from using military force against Taiwan by showing strength and resolve, and by making our forces ready to fight. Consequently, this option immediately moves additional forces into the theater and positions those forces already in theater to withstand a Chinese first strike and then be ready to quickly counterattack. We will use non-kinetic means early to go after Chinese communication and intelligence networks and to defend our own networks in anticipation of Chinese attacks. Now, the pros here, Mr. President, are that this option could push China to back down, and it puts us in a better position if things do go south and a war starts. The con, on the other hand, this option could inadvertently convince China that we are actually intending to attack and might push them to be more aggressive and to act in ways that they might otherwise not. Moreover, we actually can't get many more forces to the theater on short notice, and our posture in Asia is vulnerable to attack.
On the other hand, Madam President, given that we are uncertain But given that we are uncertain exactly what China is planning, we also have a second option for you to consider, option B. Option B is designed to avoid provoking China by showing restraint. We're going to work together with our allies and partners in the region and beyond to attempt to negotiate with the Chinese. And we will avoid moving US forces in any way that might signal a US intent to escalate the situation. On the upside, this option could avoid a war that could escalate very quickly, a war in which US military could sustain significant losses, and a war in which there would be a large number of civilian casualties. On the downside, this option could give China the signal that the United States does not plan to intervene, giving them the proverbial green light to proceed in taking Taiwan by force if that is, in fact, what they're planning to do. This option also leaves US forces very poorly positioned to respond quickly to further Chinese aggression should that come to pass.
Sir or ma'am, we're in a tough spot. We don't have a combat-ready posture in Asia. We don't have a large number of forces that can reach into a contested environment like the Taiwan Straits and strike critical targets at a moment's notice. And our communications and intelligence networks that we rely on are vulnerable to first strikes. Any move that we make under these circumstances to prepare for war could look like we're going to go on the offensive. If we don't move at all, we look like we're preparing to hand Taiwan and perhaps our Pacific position over to China without a fight. So, Mr. President or Madam President, what is your choice? You have 10 seconds to decide. Please vote now using the app.
Okay, that's time.
It appears that you've selected option A. Mr. or Madam President, here's what's happened as a result of your decision. China perceived our preparations as a prelude to war and decided to launch a full invasion of Taiwan. They figured that now was the time to act before Taiwan could potentially slip through their fingers. They began by attacking our communications and intelligence networks, which are degraded but functioning. Unfortunately, the satellites we use to communicate at long range are not working, so we're having difficulty coordinating our operations. Thankfully, our preemptive attacks on China's networks prevented a worse outcome, and we have limited their ability to see and strike targets at long ranges. Taiwanese forces have taken heavy losses from Chinese missile and airstrikes. Our bases in Japan and Guam have been damaged, but resumed flight operations within several days. Unfortunately, even with our preparations, dozens of aircraft were lost on the ground because planes are concentrated at a small number of bases that lack adequate defenses. On a more positive note, China's heavy-handed attacks on Japanese bases have marshaled support among the populace there for the US-led coalition. And moreover, China has suffered losses of aircraft and ships and has expended large numbers of scarce long-range munitions.
So we have two new options for you on how to proceed from here. Option A. This aggressively attacks the long-range sensors and communications networks that form the eyes, ears, and nervous system of China's anti-access area denial, or A2AD network. In addition, our forces under this option would attack China's integrated air defense system, key ports, airfields, and other military infrastructure, including many targets on the Chinese mainland. Now, the pros here are that taking down China's A2AD network will allow us to use a much greater proportion of our military forces. The cons, on the other hand, are that taking out China's eyes, ears, nervous system, and air defenses would require basically every strike asset and weapon we have in our inventory. This leaves very little to directly stop the invasion. Additionally, these widespread attacks, including on China's command and control networks, could be more likely to prompt escalation.
On the other hand, we have a second option for you here. Like before, option B focuses on directly defending Taiwan, attacking only those Chinese forces that are involved in the invasion, with very, very limited attacks against targets on the Chinese mainland. And the upside here is that this course of action would keep us focused on the primary objective, which is defending Taiwan. And it also reduces the risk of further escalation. On the other hand, under this approach, we're going to have to attack Chinese forces directly where their defenses are the strongest. We'll be attacking right into the teeth of the Chinese A2AD network that Chris told you about at the top of the program. We have some aircraft and some munitions that can survive in that environment, but not enough. And our forces will take significant losses.
Mr. or Madam President, by moving quickly, China is taking away our time and our decision space. We have enough time and weaponry to take down China's defenses and bring the rest of our forces to bear, or we can leave their defenses intact and try to defend Taiwan directly. But we don't have the time or resources to do both. Once again, you have 10 seconds to decide. Please vote using the app now. You've selected option B.
Pretty close.
Okay.
And here's what's happened. Sir or ma'am, China has invaded Taiwan, executing simultaneous amphibious and airborne assaults. We have launched a massive attack on the invasion fleet, relying on standoff weapons and submarines, as most other platforms are too vulnerable to Chinese missiles and other defensive systems. The attack has successfully destroyed much of China's invasion fleet, but it's come at a high cost. Our forces have suffered losses on the ground of over 100 aircraft and several ships. As well as in air combat, we've lost several squadrons of aircraft. Our forces are also running low on critical munitions. Chinese forces are holding the beach in Taiwan, but are struggling without the reinforcements and resupply they need from across the strait. It's the situation as it stands today. We now have 2 more options for you on how to proceed.
Option A continues to aggressively and directly attack Chinese forces conducting and supporting the invasion. Now, the pros here are that attacking all the forces supporting the invasion, including those still on the mainland, gives us the best chance of stopping that invasion. The cons, of course, are that this more aggressive approach will likely result in more U.S. attrition, and we are unsure as to how China will react to the outright defeat of its invasion attempt.
Option B would continue to limit U.S. action to supporting Taiwan's forces in defense of the island, limiting attacks on the Chinese mainland instead focusing only on direct support to Taiwanese forces minimizes further U.S. losses and reduces the risk of further escalation. But on the other hand, by not striking the mainland to interdict forces that are moving from China to Taiwan, we place a greater burden on already stressed Taiwanese forces, and they could very well lose.
Sir or ma'am, all things being equal, we would prefer to operate aggressively with minimal restrictions on the kinds and locations of targets that we can hit. But things aren't all equal here. China isn't Iraq or Yugoslavia. They have sophisticated means to attack us in the homeland, and they always have the resort to nuclear weapons and other forms of strategic escalation. Furthermore, attacking into their still functioning A2AD defenses is going to result in a large number of U.S. casualties. Once again, you have 10 seconds to decide. Please vote now using the app.
Interesting.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Oh, wait.
Statistically significant. All right. We're going to have to go.
Ooh.
Wow.
We're running a little ahead on time, so we will give you both options in the event of a tie.
All right.
I mean, but this just goes to show
Yeah.
how difficult this is.
Yeah.
This is hard. There's no clean right answer here.
So, sir or ma'am, if you have selected option A, here's where it ended up. Our interdiction has significantly weakened the Chinese invasion force by cutting off their resupply and their reinforcement. Taiwan's forces, with the aid of US air power, have pushed Chinese forces back to the beach. However, Chinese defensive and strike systems have levied a heavy price on US forces. We've lost hundreds of aircraft, both on the ground and in the air, and we've lost handfuls of destroyers and other surface vessels and some submarines as part of this attack. We've also expended the vast majority of our stockpiles of critical precision-guided munitions. At this point, China's leadership is weighing its options between retreat and further escalation. The coalition, per your orders, is posturing for a blockade of China's energy imports and other measures to coerce China into ceasing hostilities. Under the circumstances, sir or ma'am, this is about as good an outcome as we could have possibly hoped for. Well done, Mr. or Mrs. President. Taiwan is still partly occupied, but it looks as though the government and Taipei can hold. China's forces have been badly mauled. The United States has made good on its security guarantee. The cost, however, has been enormous, and the endgame remains unclear. China can keep going, or it can back down, bide its time, and attempt it again. The decision now is largely in Beijing's hands. Now, can we show what would happen if they had selected B?
For the roughly half of the room that did select B.
Yeah. Coin toss.
So, Madam or Mr. President, you selected option B, and here's where we've ended up. China exploited the halt in US interdiction attacks, reinforced its position on Taiwan, resupplied its force there, and used that time and space to seize Taipei. Taiwan's government and military have retreated into the mountains and vowed to continue fighting, but it's unclear how realistic this is under the circumstances. Because our forces were less engaged, we took fewer losses and expended fewer munitions. Per your direction, we have begun directing escalation and coercion options, including blockades of China's energy imports and strikes on China's overseas bases in Djibouti and the Spratlys. However, our coalition partners are skeptical of this approach. Taipei has fallen, and while they are pledging to continue resistance, it's very unclear what power Taiwan's government and military still have. China's forces have taken major casualties, but the limitation on our strike and interdiction campaign allowed them to consolidate their gains on the island, and more Chinese flow into Taiwan day by day. From the perspective of our regional allies and partners, the United States' effort was half-hearted. Capitals throughout the region begin to seriously question how reliable the Americans are, and our position in East Asia is now immeasurably weaker.
Okay, so what have we learned from this exercise today? Aside from the fact that, from the near tie we had in Move 3, these are difficult choices, and there is not necessarily a clean answer in all cases. But first, there are 4 things that the current American way of war assumes that US forces will have. The first is time. We assume that the United States will fight at a time and in a place of its choosing. The second is sanctuary. We also assume that US bases and the homeland are going to be safe from enemy attack. The third is superiority. We assume that US forces will be able to gain information, air, and maritime dominance before moving to defeat adversary forces. And the last is escalation control. We assume that the US approach can be maximally aggressive without having to worry about escalation.
However, as you saw throughout this exercise, these assumptions no longer hold when you're competing with a great power adversary like China. Competitors like China can control the tempo of a crisis, most worryingly by presenting us with a fait accompli on Taiwan. Current US military strategy is predicated on methodically building up forces in the region before countering the actual aggression at hand. China can hold our forward bases and forces at risk with air and missile strikes, and absent efforts to make our posture more resilient, this places US forces in a bit of a dilemma. We can move more forces into the theater, but without a better and more resilient posture, that just makes those forces targets for Chinese air and missile attacks. If, on the other hand, we hold our forces further away from China, that limits their ability to bring lethal effects to bear at a time and place that we need it. The lack of time, combined with our inability to operate close into China and our insufficient stocks of critical munitions, may force us into a difficult choice. We can either attack China's defenses in an attempt to bring the large portion of our joint force to bear, or we can attempt to defend our allies and partners and vital interests directly and accept attrition, but we probably don't have the time or the resources to do both of those choices. Our military strategy has to account for the ability of China to escalate strategically, including through the use of nuclear weapons. In the event of war, we don't need to treat China with kid gloves, but nor can the gloves come off entirely.
So I want to emphasize that I think, as Senator Hawley put it very well this morning, the Department of Defense's national defense strategy is actually seized with this problem. So the Department of Defense has been given a clear vector, as he said this morning, I think very well, and as Secretary Shanahan has made clear, the fait accompli is the pacing problem for the department. And as Secretary Shanahan and Senator Hawley also have made clear, it's about China fundamentally. That is the pacing challenge, obviously Russia as well. But the question is how. That's a vector. American defense strategy is pointing in the right direction, but just getting the vector is only the beginning of the problem. And I think, based on my own experience with Secretary Mattis, what I know that he wanted then to turn it over to the professionals, to people wearing uniform often, but not always, to figure out what that means, how the force changes in terms of its operations, in terms of technology, in terms of posture, and figure out with a clear strategic objective. Now, that's what I think we have as a country, but the question is, where do we go? And I would really commend Chris's report on A New American Way of War as the single best, most lucid statement of what the military problem is in its political context. If you want to understand very clearly what the Department of Defense and what our allies and partners need to be grappling with, you can't go to a better place. And Chris is going to be, and our whole program is going to be working on an effort to figure out what does that New American Way of War look like. And we invite all of your engagement and effort, and we look forward to what Chris and this effort produces going forward.
Okay. Now we'd like to take some questions from you, from the audience. As a reminder, you can submit them through Twitter using the hashtag CNAS 2019. You can submit them through the app, and you could also submit them using the note cards that you'll find stationed around the room. And the first question we have is, what are the key U.S. interests at stake in a hypothetical invasion by China of Taiwan?
Sure. I mean, I think the way to think about a Taiwan problem is twofold. One is that Taiwan is wrapped up with the credibility of American security assurances more broadly, but certainly in the Asia-Pacific, and it's a militarily significant target. One of the reasons that I personally focus so much on the Taiwan issue is that wars tend to happen over the ragged edge of security commitments. One of the reasons the American military hasn't won a war like World War II in the last 70 years is that the American military has been so powerful, and in many respects its lines have been very clear. Your adversary is not going to take you on where your advantage is manifest and where your commitment is clear. Taiwan and in Europe and the Baltics kind of are at the ragged edge of our security commitment, and Taiwan is a particularly difficult problem because the Chinese want it. The military balance has shifted as the PLA has developed in capability. The people of Taiwan don't want to join with China for obvious reasons, as we see in Hong Kong today. And American credibility is wrapped up in it, whether we want to admit that or not. Now, the Taiwan Relations Act and the Six Assurances and other things have implicated our credibility. But I think as a practical matter, governments in the region basically look at it as a bellwether, and it's a reasonable course. If the Americans say, well, you know, it's sort of a half-hearted fake commitment to Taiwan, and the reason is that we are scared of Chinese military power, what does that say if you're making decisions in Manila or ultimately in Tokyo or Jakarta or beyond? You say, well, I see that the shadow of Chinese military power has been enough to back the Americans off of Taiwan. They'll come up with some excuse for me later, and my better course is to accommodate. The other thing I think to really emphasize about Taiwan is that Taiwan is militarily significant. It forms a sort of a cork in the first island chain. I think Chris could elaborate on this point, which is that the Chinese have to focus on this problem. They have to develop their force to deal with it. And they, if they're able to take Taiwan, whether peacefully or not, that allows unimpeded power projection beyond the first island chain and has real security and defense implications for Japan in particular. The other point I want to make is, you know, we're not, the United States, as I think Senator Hawley really eloquently put it this morning, you know, we have to correlate our commitments with our strategic interests. We can't be doing, you know, this is not 1999 or 2003 where we're, you know, committing to everything and anything. But Taiwan is feasible. This is a tractable problem. We can help Taiwan defend itself. Now, Taiwan really needs to do its part and develop the capabilities to defeat an invasion and make itself resilient to a blockade. But really, fundamentally, what we and they have to do together is be able to deny the Chinese an invasion. As Chris put it, they have to cross 100 nautical miles of water and sustain an amphibious assault. That is really hard. And if they end up trying to place a blockade, they're going to have to start shooting at American ships. And they're going to have to start starving people on the island of Taiwan. That gives us, it's a tractable problem. So I think our interests are significant. It has a significant bellwether effect, and it's a tractable problem.
I think you nailed it.
Yeah. So we have two questions here that are kind of resource related, which I always like. What are the key investments here that we need to make to get after this problem? And I would just suggest it's kind of a temporal question, right? There are near-term things and then longer-term things that we need to be thinking about. Both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. There are a handful of things that we need to do in the relatively near to short term to shore up what I might call the current way of war, because we're not going to turn the department on a dime and have a new way of war kind of in a budget or two budgets or even in a full 5-year future years defense program. So I think you have to find ways of shoring up the problem now. And some of the basic things are we need to develop a more resilient C4ISR architecture. We cannot be vulnerable to kind of a handful of first strikes, whether it's in cyber and space or using the electromagnetic spectrum to exploit our communications that we can't see or communicate with each other deep into the operational area. I think the next thing I would say is we have to make our basing posture in Asia more resilient. This includes things like active defenses. So I think in particularly cruise missile defense is a huge area of potential opportunity in these. And we have kind of systematically underinvested in these in the past. So these are places where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to be gathered. The next thing are some passive defenses, and that kind of forces China to shift how it targets the bases. And the last is the development of dispersal options for bases and more resilient postures so that an attack on one location doesn't take our combat power from 10 all the way down to 3, but maybe takes it from 10 down to 8.
Yeah.
I think over the longer term, I think what you ought to see are kind of developments of new operational concepts that should guide our thinking about these problems. And so I don't think the problems themselves go away, but it is possible that our solutions to the problems change. So could we think about what might aerospace power look like without large forward operating bases for aircraft? Right? If we know they're vulnerable, we know that they can't really be adequately defended, do we continue operating out of large forward air bases, or do we find another way to bring aerospace power to bear? I think the same thing goes with networking. Do we fight to keep the network up, or do we think about networks in a different way and think about communications in a different way? And perhaps does it have implications for how we operate?
Yeah. I'll offer on the longer term piece of this question and commend a report published just 2 weeks ago by Bob Work and Greg Grant, you can also find out in the lobby, which talks about the US military technological edge, where we are in that competition vis-a-vis China, and what we need to do to maintain and even extend that advantage from where we are right now. And that's going to be a really critical part of the longer term resource question.
Yeah, and I'd just say I think one of the really important things that was kind of implicit in what Chris was saying is really that we're focused on a particular political objective within a set of political or sort of strategic bounds. Sometimes you hear about, well, we're losing the edge in this domain, or the Russians and the Chinese are doing this. And I think the problem with that kind of thinking is it doesn't give you a sort of heuristic by which to make decisions. How do we decide what we want to invest in? What road do we want to go down? And I think what the National Defense Strategy, the logic is trying to do is to say, look, these are the key problems. You know, defending these vulnerable allies and partner like Taiwan, and saying, how do we do this in a way that's consistent with our political interests, in a way that kind of puts the burden of escalation onto the other side. And I think you saw in this scenario how the burden of escalation did end up on China's shoulders, in the sense that they could escalate the war, but that wouldn't necessarily have improved in fact, it would not have improved their position. But so I think what we're trying to do here is to connect the sort of the military analysis and the defense analysis with the strategic level, technological advancements with like our colleagues in the technology program, Paul Shari, Mike Horowitz, Kara Frederick, and so forth. But again, really focused on this, because $750 billion or whatever the department's going to get is a lot of money, but it can get frittered away pretty quickly, and they're multi-theater demands we've seen in the Middle East these days. So I think that's really where we're trying to say this is a logic that will help people to figure out how do you actually allocate those resources and effort.
Further to that point, Bridge, I'll just plug my own report because you didn't. Strategy to Ask, available in the lobby, which also talks about the balance of accepting risk in the present versus risk in the future when you're making these kinds of resource decisions, and whether it would in fact be wise to accept a little more risk in the near term in order to reduce the risk that we'll face in the long term when it comes to the size and shape of the force. I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your participation.